Earlier in my Knowing Violence project, I've considered the food-violence juncture and asked why food might pose special opportunities for violence, concluding that the greatness of this potential lies largely in the fact of food's simultaneous carnality and transcendence. Now I consider a particular food act, perhaps it's even a foodway insofar as it is installed and encoded in the cultures that, like ours, practice it, that rises to the apogeic fullness of the food violence potential and converts food into not merely a weapon, but a bona fide instrument of torture. We're accustomed to thinking of the food act's potential to invoke a consummation. The cannibal eats the body and incarnates the valorous qualities of his defeated foe. The underachieved lover renews his hope and strength by feasting on oysters or tiger penis. The harried body souls who shuffle along in this vale of tears drink in spiritual sustenance in the transfigured body and blood of Christ himself. But what is the flip side of this consummating food act? That which transforms the eater into not merely something worse, but something substantially different and inferior, that which consummates negatively rather than positively. We might be tempted with the case of the forbidden food, the Islamic pig, the Hindu cow, and so on. But I think these all fall short and fail to provoke a negative transformation so total as, say, Enkidu's bread or the Christian Eucharist provokes in the positive. If eating bread made Enkidu man, what might unmake him? I propose that it is when the food act becomes a torture act. For Scary, torture convenes the unmaking of the world, annihilates its logic, its meaning. The domestic act of protecting, and what could be more ostensibly domestic than feeding or eating, domesticating the world inside our bodies and seeding ourselves in the world, becomes an act of hurting, and in hurting, the object becomes what it is not. And in this notness, the fact of civilization is itself annihilated. For Ameri, in torture, the logic of the world is emptied, laid bare in all its absurdity. The tortured man, Ameri writes, stays tortured. This is a radical transformation. Can food really be its vector? I claim that it can be, and that it is food's liminal position between corporality and transcendence that makes it not only capable but potent in this role. What is this food act to which I refer, the food act that becomes one with the torture act? You have already known it, I think. Force feeding. In his relatively obscure essay, Hunger Artists and Hunger Strikers, which is excellent, by the way, and which I encourage you to make less obscure, Duzenus weaves Kafka's Kafkaesque depiction of the hunger artist with the real witness borne by immigrant hunger strikers in contemporary Greece to illustrate the hunger striker's effectivity, the hunger artist's art, and the possibilities for individual sacrifice, saker fakir, making sacred, and corresponding communifice. The hunger strikers took a wager with mortality. They reminded that the theologico-political order, based on the ability to take life and let live, can be disrupted by removing the power of life and death from the sovereign. They faced death in order to remove the power to kill from the master. The strategy of the striker is to overpower the oppressor with the spectacle of his disempowerment. This is the hunger strike tradition. But Duzenus stops prematurely in the argument. If the victory of the hunger-striking man lies in overpowering the powerful with the force of the striker's own disempowerment, this can be only so long as the powerful chooses not to invoke the full potential of his power. For the powerful can, of course, claim his excess even in this act, seizing from the striker even that man's power to die. He has the power not only to make die, but also that to make live. The overpowerer can again overpower. He can always overpower. I refer here, of course, to the obvious. The powerful can negate the disempowered man's last clutch of sovereignty by force-feeding him. Now, in a hyper-modern biopolitical order in which biopower has not excised sovereign power, but replaced in its pulsing veins a diffuse prerogative not of making die and letting live, but of making live and letting die, in force-feeding this program arrives at its point of hyperbolic excess. Making live takes on not Foucault's sense of facilitating, fostering, potentializing life, but of obligating it, compelling it, of imposing a duty to live, a penalty of life, and of a life lived within the enforced strictures of the particularly normalized biopolitical order. This is Illich's fetishized life and the power to compel it. This is my point of departure, then. If force-feeding seems distant, uncommon, unknowable, it is because for the most part, most of us avert our eyes and our minds to its ordinariness. I invite you now to look and think upon it more closely as I wander through 4 scenes near enough our everyday. Meditate on 2 aspects of each scene. First, the subjects who comprise it, both the subject's agent and the subject's patient. And second, on food itself. I explicate the subject's subjectivity to an only limited degree, and I explicate the role of food even less. Still, I hope my portraits here will make both aspects surface well enough for you to apprehend them, and I hope that you'll collect those pickings for contemplation. 4 everyday scenes of force feeding. Let's take the first scene as a sort of warm-up. Ducks and geese and fatty livers. Since France is not one of the at least 15 countries, this is the most recent total I could verify, that ban foie gras production on the basis of its cruelty, perhaps we'll be able to personally know foie gras this evening. I won't linger on foie too promiscuously. I want primarily to recognize its conflictive significance and its measured legislative repulsion from these protected islands of humane civility. I'm certain you know the basics of foie gras production. Factory-housed ducks or geese are force-fed through tubes installed in their throats. This supernutrition has an effect on their livers, and that effect being gastronomically appreciated, the animal is slaughtered and its fatty liver delivered to haute cuisine chefs for the satisfaction of haute cuisine clients. Many people oppose foie gras production and consumption because they consider the animal's force-feeding excessively cruel and inhumane. Campaigns, such as those by PETA and Stop Gavage that I'm showing in the background, continue to oppose it in a formal political plane, and some significant number of nations and smaller administrative polities agree with the sentiment enough to inscribe their repulsion into bodies of law. That is to say, there is at least something that strikes many people as unsavory about the force-feeding affair, even when it comes to these diminutive, feathered, seafaring creatures that seem to have little in common with man, and even when the upper limit of humaneness surpassed, in this case, refers to the degraded humanity of the offender, not of the offended. The second case hits a little closer to our human hearts, but not too close, insofar as the violator and violated alike are others to the imperial Western eye, primitive savages who yet lack sufficient education and formation to merit full membership in the universal humanity so proclaimed by the end of history modern West. Le bleu or gavage are common terms for the northern African practice of forcibly fattening girls into proper women. But it isn't as innocent a practice as the Western observer might like. Indeed, there's another term for it, algar, from gar, deception. Girls are usually sent away from home for fattening, perhaps to a sturdy grandmother or aunt, perhaps to a sort of fat camp. Violence is expected. Popenoe writes of the common knowledge that even among the most docile young girls, physical inducements to fattening would be required, and hence women who fattened girls were expected to be fit. Old women could not fatten a girl anymore because they were too weak to hit anyone. What is most interesting in this case is not so much the practice of le bleu or algar or gavage itself, but rather the humane Western reaction to it. You'll find few, I haven't managed to track down any, examples of non-local support for the practice. On the contrary, all Western examples I find, searching in English, Spanish, Italian, and French, refer to the practice in terms of cruelty or torture, or as matters of human rights, children's rights, or international law. There's political activation to end the practice, too, with human rights groups working at the level of the UN. All the humane, well-evolved people of Western order that I can find insist on the practice's barbarity and attribute its practice to the vestiges of a backward, primitive, uncivilization governed by peculiar anti-advanced tradition. One human rights lawyer, explaining the hypocrisy that, while Mauritania is signatory to international treaties prohibiting such treatment, she had never managed to successfully bring a case in defense of a force-fed child. The politicians are scared of questioning their own traditions. Hold on to that last line. Here's a representative sample of the Western layperson reaction I found in response to articles and videos on the practice. It's really sad. All the parents doing this to their kids should, along with the government for allowing this, be beaten till bloody and crying. It's inhumane. I just don't understand. I'm sickened and saddened. Uncivilized. This is abuse and needs to be stopped. Savages. The reactions I'm sharing are, as far as I can tell, universal among the English-speaking, newspaper-reading, YouTube-watching public. Observers of Le Bleu are certain. The practice is backwards, savage, wrong, and bad. So are the people who realize it. And it seems that these entire societies are in desperate need of an externally imposed, civilizationally flavored cultural intervention. In the third case, we move a step closer to the identifiable subject, prison force feeding. I started this undertaking referring to the hunger striker, and while Dusinus's hunger striker undertook his sacrifice communifice in the streets, many hunger strikers undertake theirs in prisons. Think especially, for example, of the traditions, as it were, of the suffragettes, Palestinian protesters, Guantanamo internees, and Irish Republicans. Some might recognize my last name, and yes, Thomas Ashe, the first famous Irish hunger striker of the modern era, is a distant relative and the early source of my interest in these questions. What you might not know is that Ashe died not from starvation, but from the brutality of a savage, as per customary, force-feeding at the hands of his British captors. The inquest into his death condemned the inhuman and dangerous operation, force-feeding, performed on the prisoner, and other acts of unfeeling and barbaric conduct. And O'Moran, with or without exaggeration, it matters little, writes that Ashe's death and funeral has made 100,000 Sinn Féiners out of 100,000 constitutional nationalists. As Dusinus shows, the committed hunger striker claims power by making visible and sensible and consequential, publicly to the community, his disempowerment. When he is victorious and lives, it is his very disempowerment that empowers him. When he dies from starvation, he is a martyr. And when neither of these happen and he is actively killed in the brutality of force feeding, well, his is martyrdom squared. Let's think more closely now about what prison-style force-feeding entails and who acts in the drama. Victims describe it with equally palpable parts inarticulability and pain. Judith Todd, a Rhodesian hunger striker force-fed in 1972, ended her strike early. "I couldn't take it," she said. "I failed. I would have gone on with the hunger strike, but force-feeding I could not take." Samir Naji al-Hassan Mokbel, more recently force-fed in Guantanamo, wrote, "I will never forget the first time they passed the feeding tube up my nose. I can't describe how painful it is to be force-fed this way. There was agony in my chest, throat, and stomach. I had never experienced such pain before. I would not wish this cruel punishment on anyone." Bystanders and witnesses, even those far enough from the action to enjoy a sort of emotional buffer, add their voices to the protestive chorus. The Irish press published an op-ed denouncing the 1974 force-feeding of the Price sisters, IRA prisoners force-fed in British prisons. How many of us would want to live after being forcibly fed? This is an experience much worse than rape. The emotional assault on the person can be permanently damaging. To restrain, even to punish, is one thing. To torture is something very different. It would seem that those who give instructions for forcible feeding and those who obey should be judged like the torturers of the concentration camps, the rapists of certain Far East campaigns, and the perverters of children. Around the same time, Dr. Brian Laverty addressed the Irish Civil Rights Association, saying that the effect of force feeding was similar to multiple rape, that the Price sisters' treatment contravened the UN Declaration on Human Rights, and that it was inhuman, degrading, and lowered the dignity of man. More recently, reacting to the controversies surrounding Guantanamo, bioethics scholar George Annis wrote that force-feeding a competent person is not the practice of medicine. It is aggravated assault. Using a physician to assault prisoners no more changes the nature of the act then using physicians to monitor torture makes torture a medical procedure. I'll indulge now in one of Jerry Kelly's poems at some length. Kelly, an IRA prisoner force-fed in English prisons in 1973-74, has spoken and written about the brutality of force-feeding, laboring to describe the indescribable, for example, as like a hot knitting needle being pushed in between my nose and eyes. Kelly describes the anticipation of the call, the beckoning, the reckoning. Note especially now his description of the dapper doctor and the discursive gymnastics he must perform to fulfill his office. After 19 foodless days, the pain of hunger, this usurper of senses, was itself usurped by fear. For some hours since, the dapper doctor announced that he would return to force-feed the prisoner. He later changed this to artificially feed the patient. Fear had feasted on his self-doubt. From the ballad of his school days, from the archives of his mind, the specter of Tom Ashe's force-fed death appeared. And then the moment of the prisoner's recollection comes, and note again the disconsonant figure of the doctor, and compare it with the fragility, impotency, and hopelessness, there's no other word for it, of the prisoner. 12-handed they entered, in angry flood, frothing hospital white on incriminating blue, while the doctor, from deep-seated elitism, affected detachment in civilian hue. Bony resistance cruelly subdued, prison stripped to helplessness, then stretched to hopelessness under doctor's orders. And then the force-feeding act itself comes. No speech is possible, nor motion of limbs, protest undiluted in dilated eyes. This is the surreal experience of nightmares, where great fear invokes paralysis, all of which the doctor hippocratically explained was for his own good, to save his life. Tom Ashe, comfort and fear. And so it ends for one day. For now, let's go on to our fourth scene, our final one. This one shares much with the preceding one. Like prison force-feeding, it is inscribed in national regimes of legal admissibility. It is administered to the body according to similar protocol by similarly positioned doctors, and it is likewise in contravention of International Human Rights Convention. If you're interested, I include a discussion of this in the corresponding paper. But now the subject is very different. She is the anorexic, or in any case the skinny woman, the imputed or alleged anorexic, whose crime of illicit appearance constitutes a crime as socially offensive as the freedom fighter's crime is politically so. In this scene, Dusinus's crucial aspect of the communifice disappears. The non-mediatized and invisibilized, community isolated and community shunned, discursively dissimulated and wholly unshared force-feeding of the anorexic retains all the personal negation of the hunger striker without any of the corresponding positivity that lies in its community constructing sense. Hers, and it is always a she, that's a subject for another moment, is a space into which the female homo sacer gets expelled, a space whose exteriority defines the interiority of the greater society, a space in which she becomes an instrument for making not her community, but for laying the definitional limits of the broader one. Alleged anorexics are force-fed, justly punished for their offenses, and simultaneously reformed corporally, remade into bodies conformant to the social norm. In 2014, I was charged with and convicted of anorexia in Britain, and I came to know that of which I write in the first person. I know that it is more than violent. It is torturous, even when dissembled into more placable terms. The 1984 UN Convention on Torture defines torture in terms we're familiar with. As we know, though, law's interminably interpretable and recastable ductility makes it often only a justifying convenience for the powerful. In the USA, for example, post-war on terror politics compelled the need for a more restrictive, less demanding definition, and the Department of Justice restricted its bounds considerably. According to this more demanding definition, for an infliction to be considered torture, the pain delivered, quote, must be so great that it would ordinarily be associated with a sufficiently serious physical condition or injury, such as death, organ failure, or serious impairment of bodily functions. I suppose I'm in the unusual position to make a direct comparison. I have experienced death, organ failure, serious impairment of bodily function, and torture in its guise as force feeding. Given a choice, I would choose death or organ failure over force feeding without a second thought. The British oops that resulted in Thomas Ashe's death in 1917 is an oops the same disciplinary apparatus continues to make today. Nearly 100 years after British prison medics killed Ashe 1, they nearly killed Ashe 2 in remarkably analogous method. And it seems that this was no isolated accident. In 2016, the British National Health Service released a, quote, patient safety alert titled Nasogastric Tube Misplacement, Continuing Risk of Death and Severe Harm. And I will say that nasogastric tube misplacement is very easy to realize when the doctor's operational motive is punitive rather than curative. My case exemplifies the punitive disciplinary function of force feeding, for its exceptionality as well as for its normality. It was wholly ordinary in the sense that Mary Gordon, the First Lady Inspector of English Prisons, wrote in 1922. An offender is sent to prison by the judge or magistrate so that he may undergo penal discipline which, with loss of liberty, is his punishment. He can be forcibly fed, a treatment called medical, but in reality disciplinary, in order to prevent his determining his imprisonment. In short, we are not afraid to hurt, to injure, or to cause him to run risks in order to master him. Force-feeding disciplines the prisoner, masters him, and that was its aspiration in my case, to take this offensive, offending body and reform it. Now, my case was also peculiar, exceptional. Unlike the political prisoners, and unlike the authentically anorexic prisoners, however, and this is especially notable given the brutality of the practice, I did not and had never refused to eat. That is ultimately irrelevant in this ethical analysis, I think, but it does remain an impressive flourish in the great spectacle of my captors' brutality that they prohibited me from eating to instead force feed me for the express purpose of producing its brutality upon and within my body. The metaphor of rape that we heard earlier is very good. Note the special dynamic of sexual power and violation at work in the anorexic prison. Force feeders are often, always in my experience, men, and the force-fed nearly always women. The act entails penetrating a woman's orifice with a 3-foot-long phallic appendage not invited, but forced, and forced again. And this forced appendage does not smoothly withdraw some minutes later, calmly remove itself in satisfied bliss, but instead it remains, spewing its foreign semen for hours and days and weeks and months, and sometimes even years. And the metaphor continues in too much perfection. This weapon is organic, its seed becoming a part of me. Dusinus began this reflection for us by drawing upon Kafka's Hunger Artist, but his excellent analysis of food and power has its limits. In this essay, perhaps I've moved into another of Kafka's worlds, the penal colony, where the condemned man's badness is inscribed upon his body. Ascertaining guilt is unnecessary here, for in the case of the alleged anorexic, one's guilt is visible and certain. It is the illicit appearance. The condemned man, the condemned woman, must be made to understand the gravity of her transgression. She does. As in Kafka's world, she gets to know it in the flesh. I got to know it in the flesh. I don't speak that punishment as well as some of the others. But, like Ahmedi said, the tortured man stays tortured, and my body speaks it for me. This is the mat I sleep on every night. I would have liked to articulate more precisely the subjects in these 4 scenarios, the violated and the violators, the order-giving commandants and the bureaucrats of torture, and the bystanders too. And I would have liked to have more carefully explored the special effectiveness of food here in its guise as torture, penetrating, permeating the body and soul, and unmaking worlds with its violation. I hope to have in any case painted a few scenes for your continuing observation and reflection. You can find the text version of this piece with full references and a pre-recorded video version online if you'd like to revisit these questions. You can also easily find me online, and I warmly invite, now or later, your reflections and conversation.